Good afternoon. I'm Ellen Clore. I'm on the board of the Textile Arts Council, and I want to welcome you this afternoon to our second talk in our series, The Arts and Crafts Heritage of William and May Morris. Before we started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Textile Arts Council. We are a support group for the Costume and Textile Arts Department at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Members' dues and donations help fund things like exhibitions such as the Contemporary Muslim Fashions exhibit, and also contribute to the purchase of new articles for the museum's collection. And of course, also fund our programming. What I love about TAC is the broad spectrum of people's interests. There are people in the group that love couture fashion, and there are people in the group that love Japanese boro and sort of everything in between. We have monthly lectures, which will be starting in September and will be on Zoom for as long as we need to have them on Zoom. We also have an ethnic textile study group that meets on a monthly basis, and many workshops. Yesterday we had a really great May Morris themed embroidery workshop that I attended and really enjoyed a lot myself. And in healthy times, we also have our ethnic textile bazaar, and we love to do tours. We have local tours to artist studios and also special curated tours of exhibitions. We've also done some national tours in the last couple of years. We went to New York and Los Angeles, and we had a really special trip to Seattle planned, which has been postponed, as has our international tour to London. I did want to tell you that the first lecture will be September 26th at 10 a.m. and it is entitled Youth Voices Through Textiles. It is about the Social Justice Sewing Academy, which is a youth education program that helps youth use artistic expression to express their activism. And I have seen some of their works myself at a quilt show a couple of years ago, and they're incredibly powerful in terms of their artistry and their vision. I wanted to just give you a note from if you were with us last week, there were a lot of questions about the Arabic writing that was embroidered on the child's bed cover that May Morris made. And Lucy Barter of the San Francisco School of Needlework and Designs, a colleague of hers, contacted her, told her it is a quote from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. We don't yet know what it says, but that was the origin of it. And if you recall, Virginia also mentioned that there were quotes from William Blake's Songs of Innocence on the coverlet. I was doing some reading last night and read in Apollo magazine that there are also quotes which we did not see from Plato's Republic. So that all tells us that May Morris was quite a well-educated young woman for her time. Before we go on, I just want to mention that our tapestry today is Flora, and it is part of the museum's collection. It was designed by Edward Burne-Jones, and it is a tapestry. So here we go. Today, we're going to engage with the home design and decor of Morris and Company. We're going to start by viewing a virtual tour of Standen House, a wonderful country home about an hour out of London by train in West Sussex in a little town called East Grinstead. And I love to say that name. I love the name East Grinstead. And the house was designed by Phillip Webb, who is a lifelong friend and collaborator of William Morris. And it is decorated with furniture and textiles and wallpapers from Morris and Company. Our tour will be led by Professor Abigail Harrison Moore from Leeds University. And after we view the film, she'll be coming on live. She's staying up after her bedtime to be with us today. And we'll answer questions and have a little talk. The video is shown with permission of Heni Talks. Heni Talks is the non-commercial division of Heni, which is an international arts organization. And they have created a whole series of wonderful videos on art, historical art and contemporary art. Their goal is to further art education and offer the public greater access to art in general. You can go to their website, henitalks.com, to see what else they have to offer. In the second part of our program, Shannon Davis, the creative director of Selamat Designs, which is a local San Francisco design studio, will tell us the history and heritage of Morris and Company, and also highlight Selamat's collaboration with Morris and Company, which brought William Morris's design philosophy and aesthetic to contemporary design. It all happened just last year in 2019. I would like to welcome now Professor Abigail Harrison Moore to join us. We had a few technical difficulties in the background, but we're forging ahead here and everything seems to be back on track. She's a professor of history of art and museum studies at the University of Leeds, and she served as head of the School of Fine Art, History of Art, and Cultural Studies at the university, and also developed Leeds master's program in art gallery and museum studies. Her area of specialty in research is the late 19th and early 20th century, especially the arts and crafts movement, which is perfect for us. I have to read this part off my little notes. Her last monograph was Fraud, Fakery, and False Business on the social, legal, and political aspects of the art and antiques market of England in the 1920s. In the UK, she also has focused on creative education in schools and has written extensively on that topic. Welcome, Abigail Harrison Moore. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you, TAC, for inviting me to be a part of this evening.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your history with Standen that you alluded to in the film?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you see, that final little black and white photo was supplied by my aunt, and it's me and my two cousins, Matthew and Tom, with my uncle, Robert. So Standen's a very interesting house in the fact that it was one of the first that the National Trust in England took on as a Victorian house in its own right, because up until the point where they took it on in the 1970s, they had not actually invested in houses that were simply Victorian. They always had to be connected to somebody important. And it was only through the intervention of the Victorian Society that they started to realise how important this house was and would be. Standen had, as you saw in the film, been owned, commissioned and then owned by the Beale family. And it stayed within the Beale family right the way through to Helen Beale, who was the youngest child, who you saw as a baby in that photograph of the family, and actually has a tiny little house built for her as part of the design that Phillip Webb designed specifically for her. Helen never married and stayed at the house, and because she was blind and she was wanting to move into a home, she was very, very concerned because there was various organisations in the area around East Grinstead who were very interested in taking over the house, and she didn't want that. So she tried to get the National Trust interested, and through working with the Victorian Society, they persuaded the Trust to take it on. But in the first instance, it was run by the Victorian Society. And at that point, they started realising they needed a gardener. And that's when my uncle comes in. So my uncle has a long and interesting history. He was actually trained as a stage manager at RADA, and then gave up doing the theatre because he wanted to leave London for various reasons, and ended up working for the National Trust in Cornwall. And when Standen was taken on, he was persuaded, they actually asked him to go up to Standen, and he was the sole gardener there until he retired. It was a massive estate to take on, and now I think they have about 5 gardeners there, but he was on his own. And so they moved, my aunt and uncle and their 2 very young children at the time, moved into that farmhouse. And so it just became a norm for us to go in our holidays. We're a very close family. I'm going down to see my aunt next week. And so I played in the gardens there and was very aware of it. But it wasn't until I went to St Andrews University that I discovered that this was something that you could study. I'm a child, I went to a very typical, what we call state school in the UK, government funded. No one had ever told me there was a subject called art history, let alone textile history or design history. I went to university to do English, but luckily picked up this subject called art history in my first year and discovered art history, and discovered through an amazing academic called John Free that you could study architecture. And suddenly this house that I'd grown up with came alive, and I decided to write my undergraduate dissertation on it. I was lucky enough to be able to bring together all the drawings. They were at the time separated between the Royal Institute of British Architects and this Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, and write what now I'm quite embarrassed about, but at the time I was pleased with an undergraduate dissertation about it, and I wrote it sitting at Mr. Beale's desk. So it's been there with me for a long time. I then had a weird diversion off into Chippendale for my PhD, and then recently in the last 5 years been back very much focused on the arts and crafts movement, and now very much focused on histories of electricity in the arts and crafts movement, and Standen has been at the heart of that.
Well, I never thought about how electricity impacted domestic life until last week, but I would love for you to tell us a little bit about Standen and its importance in the history of domestic electricity. Also, I'm not sure, we're having some technical difficulties, and so I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in for us, but for now, Standen and electricity.
Okay, so so as I've written about, and I on Friday submitted a book that I've co-edited with a professor in Canada, Ruth Samwell, about histories of women in electricity. The history of electricity has been very much written as a history of cities, as a history of men, as a history of invention, and as a history where once we had electricity, we of course used it. But that's not the reality, because electricity in the period that we're looking at, when Standen was built in the 1890s, was very new and was very, very scary. And Standen is very important. In the 1970s, there was a mock-up of Standen, one of the rooms, the drawing room that you saw in the film, in the Science Museum in London, because it's one of the first country houses built with electricity planned into it. And of course, that's really interesting. So a lot of people know the history of Cragside, Lord Armstrong's home in the north of England, which was the first house to have electricity put into it. He experimented, but Standen had it built into the fabric of the building. And that, for me, was fascinating because, of course, one, Phillip Webb was known as an arts and crafts designer, and the arts and crafts movement has often been talked about as that looking backwards. So we know that, for example, from Phillip Webb's workbooks, that he was going around all the building yards in the area around East Grinstead before he started designing Standen, to understand traditional techniques of building craft, of tiling, etc., etc. And so for him to actually design in this incredibly new and very scary technology was fascinating. And also, Standen's not been mentioned in the histories of electricity. So I've sort of taken it on as a one-woman campaign to bring Standen back to these histories, and working with a fellow professor at the University of Leeds, Graham Gooday, who's written this amazing book called Domesticating Electricity. We've really started to track why these particular country houses in Britain were so important in the history of starting to show how you could use electricity in the home. Because even if we had it, we didn't use it. It was very expensive. They produced it in great big jars of batteries in the barn, and then took it over to the house. It wasn't particularly reliable. And one of the interesting things about Standen is we have designs there for candlelight, for oil light, and for electricity. Because just because you could use electricity didn't mean that you always did. And the servants would still use candlelight. So yeah, so that's what I'm writing and thinking about at the moment. But what I think is really interesting at Standen is you can see there an architect and designer really thinking about the problem of bringing a new technology into a person's home. So in the lights, for example, in the drawing room, which he designed, they're based on a sunflower design, which you see he picks up with the Morris & Co. wallpaper, the Morris & Co. fabrics. So you've got sunflowers and the embossing on the fireplace, which was done by Pearson's. And Pearson helped him design the light there. And he designs a Vaseline glass that actually allows the electric light to sort of almost flicker. So although it's the newest technology, it reflects like a candlelight does. So it's just like I said in the film, Webb is a very interesting designer because he was always thinking about the people who lived within the space, the family and their servants within that space, and trying to design for them. And there's wonderful letters at Standen that he wrote to the family, often addressed to the Beale, Mrs. Beale and her daughters. So for example, he designed the wardrobe specifically to fit their daughter's height. But he writes this wonderful letter at the end talking about sitting in the morning room and looking out and realizing he's designed a home. And for him, that was what he was trying to do there.
We have a question from someone here in San Francisco. Some 1896 arts and crafts homes had dual use fixtures that used both gas and electricity. Is that the kind of thing that we see at Standen as well?
No, Standen didn't use gas. That was the one thing. And one of the things that's a particular feature of England at this period in the late 1880s and the 1890s was this massive fight going on between the gas companies and the electrical companies because they wanted to secure clients. And so getting a client like the Beales to bring electricity in Standen was really important for them. So you often saw it was either or. And gas had been very much critiqued by the electrical companies for bringing dirt into the home. So it wasn't good for your furniture. And specifically, it was seen to have a really bad effect on textiles. And that was one of the things that the electrical companies really appealed to women. So there was a woman called Mrs. Gordon, who is the wife of an electrical engineer, and probably a very good electrical engineer in her own right, who wrote a book called Decorative Electricity in the 1880s. And she talked a lot in that, because she was trying to sell electricity, her husband's business. She talked a lot about the impact of gas and the fumes from gas on fabrics. So it was a big fact, but you rarely saw oil and electrical, and you often saw oil lamps being converted to electrical lamps, but you didn't often see gas and electricity in the same home.
Some more questions. Did they tear into the walls to wire the electricity? Where did the electricity originate from? And was there an actual station that supplied the whole area?
No. Okay, brilliant question. Thank you. No, they didn't tear anything, because this was the beauty. You know, Webb only ever belonged to one organisation, that was Society of Plumbers, because he was very interested in how buildings work. You know, this is a thing about the arts and crafts movement. It was about getting back and as a sort of antidote to a machine age aesthetic, wanting to understand how things functioned. So he always prided himself on the fact his chimneys never smoked, which was a real problem in the Victorian home. And so the electricity and the wiring was built into the house, just like the plumbing was beautifully built into the house. And I talked about the water tower. So the reason I know, there's been lots of debates around who supplied the electricity, how the electricity was supplied. I'm lucky. My uncle was the gardener. And of course, one of the things gardeners know about is what's going on under the ground. And the barn that you saw in the film, that was where they had all the bottles, the jars. And we've just done an exhibition at Standen, which unfortunately shut because of COVID, but it was a beautiful exhibition designed by Ruth, the house manager there, where she did an image of all the glass bottles chugging away with the batteries in them, powering, and then wires went across that front lawn, which they call goose green, and into the house. But of course, the problem with that sort of supply was it wasn't very secure. It would often go down. It had to be watched all the time. So one of the younger male servants would spend his life in the barn checking the battery acid, etc. So yeah, so that was how it was supplied into it. The local station didn't come until the 1920s. So what's really fascinating for me, and one of the things that I've been writing about, is of course Standen was sustainable. You know, when we're thinking about a post-carbon future, particularly in the UK at the moment, we're really, beyond COVID, we're really interested in thinking about, well, what happens after gas and electricity? Well, these houses demonstrate whole ways that houses were self-sustainable. So in that film, you probably didn't even notice, but there's a shot of the house where you can see a windmill, because one of the things the Beales employed there was wind power to power the water supply to the gardens, and they employed water power. So there was a really beautiful system that would push the water into the house that meant that the water flowed really quickly. So that house was sustainable in a way that we've then forgotten, because as soon as the national grid came about, and there's lots of arguments about the national grid being something very much to do with national power and identity coming, we forgot how to do these things, and we've now got to remember again. So the National Trust at the moment is looking very specifically at how can they supply their houses, which are very, very expensive to heat and light, through solar, through wind, through other sustainable methods. It's all there in the 19th century.
Can you talk just for a minute on how electricity started with a home like this, which was very wealthy, and then how did it sort of filter down to people with less means than the Beales would have had, to middle class, and then to poorer people, working class?
This is something that Graham and I are working on at the moment, because what you see with the electrical engineers, the early engineers who are really touting for business in the 1880s and 1890s, is they're looking for celebrities. Just like now we have our eco celebrities, the people who go out there and say, you know, I've powered my house with wind, I'm going to save the whales, etc. Well, this was happening in the late 19th century as well. So they were looking at aristocrats, but they were also looking at new money. So people like Lord Armstrong, houses like Hatfield, these were seen as, and Chatsworth were seen as these very beautiful spaces to celebrate electricity, and the electrical engineers fought to get their energy in there to show off what it could do. But it really was very slow to come into the homes, and it was only really in the 1910s and the 1920s did you start to see it filtering down into the less expensive homes and into the city areas. And that really only became a norm once we started to have a national grid, once we started to have town supply. So Bradford, one of the cities near me, which now is not well known, but was described as the capital city of the world in the 19th century because it was the heart of the textile industry. That was one of the first cities to light itself with electricity and have electric trams, but it took a long time to come into homes. And as I say, there was a big competition going on. It wasn't a given that electricity was going to be the way we supplied. And of course, we still nowadays in the UK will often cook on gas, heat on gas, but light with electricity. So the idea of one or the other controlling the home never really worked. They never won, the electrical engineers.
I have several other questions. Was Standen also outfitted for gas light as well? No. Okay.
No. So gas was never, and the Beales were described as progressive politically, and I think they were progressive design-wise. They wanted to do something different there. And they very much pushed it. We have the letters that show that.
And did they use the electricity only for light? What did they use for cooking?
Only for light. Cooking was still done on a range.
Here's another one. Your discussion about electricity reminds me of a recent piece of information about the history of the bathroom being inside the house. Do you know anything about the history of bathrooms from that period?
Well, in Standen, all the bedrooms had en-suites built into them, but very few of them had baths fitted into it. It was still very much the norm at that stage that your servant would bring your water in to pour into your dressing room bath rather than having it supplied, although there was some central plumbing in the household. And it came on further, and there was periods of refitting within the house that brought plumbing in, but it was probably quite state of the art at the time, but would look very, very old fashioned to us now.
People are really interested in this. I think just like me, they've never really thought about it before. Can you explain in more detail how the electricity in the barn batteries was generated?
Oh, now we're getting into the science of it. And I'm not even going to, I love to describe the jars full of acid bubbling away, but I'm not good on the technology of it. My lovely friends who work in the history of science would be much better at that. I recommend reading Graham Gooday's book in relationship to that. But essentially it was about storing it through big glass jars. There was multiple glass jars on shelves with copper in them, bubbling away, creating the energy.
Wow. Were there any Moores and Company designed stained glass lamps in the home?
I haven't found any, no. The majority of the lamps within the home are either designed by Phillip Webb, so then it's copperware and by Pearson, and glassware by Powell, or by W.S. Benson, and Benson supplied electric lights, oil lights, and candles, beautiful candle holders for the house. They also bought directly from the department stores. Mrs. Beale was a shopper. You know, she's one of this wonderful first generation of middle-class women consumers. So she was buying from Liberty, she was buying from Heels. So it's a real mix of different lighting supplies, but no, we haven't got any. No, we haven't got any, as far as I'm thinking. Yep. No, I don't think I've ever seen anything with a stained glass shade. A recommendation is the work of Maureen Dillon. Maureen Dillon was the National Trust surveyor of lighting across all the houses. She wrote a beautiful book called Artificial Sunshine. Love that title. And so anything on the real specifics of histories of lighting, I do recommend Maureen's work as well.
A question about what fueled the range. What were they using on their cooker?
Coal.
Coal.
In England, we were coal because that was our country. And of course, Mr. Beale, I don't know if I said that. I think I did in the film. He made his money through the railways. He was a solicitor. And he did a Birmingham family, and he became very wealthy enough to own a country house in East Grinstead and a townhouse in the centre of London off High Street, Kensington, by being the solicitor to the railways. He was very involved in the development of St Pancras. And interestingly, I mentioned the Garrett cousins in the film. The Garretts were responsible for designing the first women's hospital for Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And in that, they had a big discussion about how to light the hospital, whether it was going to be gas or electricity. And Mr. Beale was on the committee of that hospital, and they talked about actually linking the electricity from St Pancras to the hospital. In the end, they went with gas. I think that was probably one because the Garrett family had made their money out of gas. Their father was worked in the gas companies, but also it meant that the Garretts got the commission every year to go and repaint the hospital because, of course, gas made all the wards dirty. So it was a gift that kept on giving, gas.
Do you want to talk about the question is, do you have a book or any articles on your electricity research so you can talk about what you've been doing this week?
So it's been a couple of years of thinking like that. So there's an article in a journal called 19th Century Context, and then Graham and I wrote an article together about using Standen as a case study in a book called Art versus Industry, which is about the history of the arts and crafts movement. And then Ruth, my colleague in Canada, who's at the University of Toronto, and I did a special edition of a journal called History of Retail and Consumption about rural energy, and that was where I wrote a chapter on water and electricity at Standen. And then the book that we submitted on Friday is with it's with the Canadian Press, McGill Queen's. Sorry, my brain just went there. It's late on a Sunday evening. McGill Queen's Press, and it's a book called Histories of in a New Light: Histories of Women and Energy, and it'll be published in the spring. And in that, I have provided a chapter all about the women decorators making a difference in the history of electricity.
These two questions are sort of combined. The first one is, are the furnishings original to the house? And the second one is, the wallpapers and textiles look to be in such good condition in the film. Are these reproductions or?
This is the utter fabulousness of Standen. You can tell I love Standen, and when all this is over, please all come over to the UK and come and visit Standen. Standen, because it stayed within the family, and because Helen Beale, I think, was the certain sort of daughter, it rarely changed. And so when it was handed over to the trust, it was handed over almost as it was when it had been designed by Webb and Morris. And one of the things I absolutely loved, you saw the bachelor's button wallpaper in the stairwell. They varnished the paper, which is a really good way of keeping paper intact. In fact, we've just put a Morris & Co honeysuckle up in our front hall, and my husband's a decorator and he varnished it. So we're learning the tradition still, because if you varnish paper, it will keep it safer. But what's really exciting was in the 1980s, Sanderson & Co. So Sanderson & Co. bought the original wood blocks when Morris & Co. went bust in the early 20th century. They bought the wood blocks and held the wood blocks. And they went back to the house when suddenly the house exploded in popularity in the 80s in England. Suddenly Morris & Co. became very fashionable again. I think it was to do with recession. I think it was to do with money, etc. And they went back to Standen and looked again at the original ones and reproduced them. So you can see both the original colorways, but also the modern colorways. And they keep going back. Morris & Co. keep going back and reproducing and creating new fabrics. So Standen is just this incredible resource for future inspiration. And I think that would be a lovely segue into our next part of this evening, because it's about the way that we look now to Morris & Co. for current design.
Well, can I ask you one more question?
Of course.
One more. Could you expand on your descriptions of the textiles that were mentioned in the video, and how important were they to the overall aesthetic of the home? I think that'll have to be our last question. It's just really fun to talk with you.
And you can tell I could tell stories about Standen forever. Yeah, each of the rooms were designed by Webb, working with the Beales, and I think again it's that relationship between the family and the designer with a theme. So, for example, you have the Larkspur bedroom, you have the drawing room, which I'm fascinated by the drawing room, the sunflower design. So each of them took inspiration from one of the designs from Morris & Co. And then you saw the textiles would work with that, the wallpaper. And also what's fabulous is that the Beale daughters and Margaret Beale were, as many Victorian women, avid embroiderers themselves. So they then designed embroideries to fit with the design. So each of the rooms at Standen has this incredible interior theme that picks up on, and it looks out, you know, one of the things about Standen when you walk around is you can look out onto this incredible landscape that my uncle was so responsible for. He really respected. Margaret Beale left all her garden diaries, and he used those to think about how you would plant. And you can see how the flowers outside come into the house in the way that Morris & Co. pick those up in the wallpapers and the textiles and the ceramics and the metal designs. And that for me is the joy of the arts and crafts movement. It's about celebrating beauty, but celebrating beauty in all its usefulness, in actually recognizing that we need that around ourselves.
Thank you so much, Abigail. It's just been a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and we practiced, and that's been so much fun. So you certainly have piqued our interest and opened up, I think, new avenues for exploration for all of us. So thank you. Little applause.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you everybody for joining.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
I now want to introduce Shannon Davis. She's the co-founder and creative director of Selamat Design. In 2019, she led a collaboration with the Morris & Company Design Archive, there she is, team, and created Morris & Company by Selamat collection, furniture, lighting, and accessories based on Morris & Company heritage designs. So welcome, Shannon. It's great to have you here with us. I'm going to disappear now for you.
Great. Thank you, Ellen, and thanks to Talk for inviting me here today. I'm really glad to be here. The journey to work with Morris & Company really years in the making. A significant portion of our practice Selamat Designs includes working with museums and archives. Sometimes digging deep into collections to resource material that feels relevant in the marketplace today. And other times our job is that of a storyteller, bringing artifacts and artists back into the public eye through reproduction and reinterpretation. Curators and archivists to protect the integrity of the source material and the artist. This has led us to work with the Monticello Fountain, Williamsburg, the state. The first step in our deeper understanding of William Morris began with an examination not only of the man, but of his company, Morris & Co. So at this point, I'm going to play a video about Morris & Co. in particular, and then afterwards we'll move to a presentation. Great, thank you. So the thing that's really so interesting about working with Morris and Company is really specifically the man, William Morris, and then also his daughter, May Morris. William Morris, let's see if I can go to the next slide here. So Morris and Company is, with one interruption right before the war period, has really functioned as an ongoing concern for its entire history. It's pivoted a lot of times, but Morris & Co. is the custodian of the archive of much of William Morris's work. As it mentioned in the short, the original blocks are there. A lot of the original pattern books are still there. And really all of this starts with the values of William Morris. Things that were so important to him as he really started off as an artist, an activist, and a craftsman. And in the end, really it's the greatest advocate for the arts and crafts movement. Master craftsmanship, integrity, legacy, and sustainability, and social conscience at each step. These values are enduring. When we look at this company today and our work really as the newest part of this legacy, these are the things that we embrace as well. Environmentally aware, thinking about how we can use nature and bring it into patterns. That obvious connection with that historical exploration of William Morris, the man, his life, where he went. There's a huge part now that really is embracing his Icelandic period. Obviously, great appreciation of the craftsmanship and just the curiosity about what drove the arts and crafts movement. As Abigail mentioned, William Morris, born 1834, really regarded by as the leading designer within the arts and crafts movement. And he was a man of many talents: poet, artist, painter, philosopher, typographer, embroiderer, political theorist. He liked to just put it all in there together. William Morris, married to Jane Burden. May Morris was their daughter. Was neat characters, and you see this in her embroidery work, and there was mention of it by Ellen from last week's presentation. She took over of Morris & Co. embroidery department, which was an exceedingly high profile position, and developed some of her own patterns that are still in existence today and still sold commercially today. Oftentimes people attribute them to her father, but she was instrumental in keeping her father's momentum and preserving his legacy to the next generation. Here we are, see this a little bit, Red House. This was the house that was mentioned previously as well. I took this, I know many of you saw the exhibit, the pre-Raphaelite exhibit that was at the Legion about a year ago or so. This was, when you walked into the exhibit, this was on the wall. And I thought it was fantastic, because one of the things you start to learn about when you start to really dive into William Morris in particular is what a web of artists and creators and poets and all these people that sort of circled together. And so this is a little bit of a drawing that tries to put everybody in perspective. And you see William Morris on the left, you see his wife, who was the muse for Rossetti in a lot of cases. There's just a lot of people that made up this pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, and then trickled into the firm, and then once again trickled into Morris and Company. The first role, grouping commercial enterprise more or less, was called the firm. It included the characters you see on the right: Morris, Burne-Jones, Webb, Faulkner. Each of them brought a different skill set really to the partnership. But really the heart of it was, how do artists study the art of the past to revitalize the art of the present? And art as more of a general term. This included furniture. Obviously, as we move more into sort of the tapestries and wall coverings, that sort of led more into the interior space. Products that came out of that for embroidery, there were some initial experiments with block wallpaper, and then sort of everybody brought their own skill set to that partnership. Morris, Marshall, Faulkner & Co., which was what kind of became the interiors group, opened their first showroom in London in 1861, moved again in 1865. And really the style at the time was heavy. French Rococo style wallpapers, silk brocades. It was layers on layers and layers and patterns and furniture and stuff. Interiors were jam-packed. Here's a comparison of really two wallpapers. The one on the left, which was actually a Sanderson paper, which you'll remember that name. It comes back around. This is very typical of the time. Heavy, rich, a lot of really strong tones. Then you move more into, this was a Morris pattern. William Morris designed it, called Pimpernel, which really looked at what was outside and brought it in. So this was, actually Pimpernel is the smaller of the flowers and not the larger flowers. Most of the patterns are named by the secondary flower for Morris, which I think is always so just sort of interesting and a little bit of a inside trick. Also in the 1860s, they really started with some furniture making. This was really the handcrafted branch of the trade part of the business. Rush seating, the Sussex chair is really one of those enduring chairs that is attributed to Morris, along with that hooded bench, which is fabulous. And there were three main furniture designers, Brown, Rossetti, and Webb. In 1875, the firm dissolved and Morris & Co. was born. It was a partnership with William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones. And they really started to focus on wallpapers, particularly hand block printed wallpapers. And a clip on pressing, which they still do today at Morris & Company. Kelmscott Manor, they moved into Scott Manor in 1871. Kelmscott Manor has a hedge that surrounds the house. That hedge really was the inspiration for so many of his patterns. Strawberry Thief is a fantastic example of a very recognizable pattern, but specifically about the activity out his window and how he wanted to bring that into his home. Merton Abbey was Morris & Co.'s first factory, let's call it. In 1881, they had 100 employees, and they really kind of were producing several things for Merton Abbey. Lots of weaving, tapestry, different types of fabric production, labor fabric production. They did carpet weaving, fabric press, silk dyeing, wool. They also had started fabric, typical indigo blues, really to stand out both in the fabrics they printed there. So there's Strawberry Thief and then Wandle as well. In 1877, they opened up another showroom, a new shop on Oxford Street that really incorporated more of the products that they were making within Merton Abbey. Stained glass, metalwork, still with tapestries, but then it branched into more furniture, jewelry, carving, glass, tiles. They had a little bit of everything. 1896, William Morris died. He's buried at Kelmscott Manor. that's where really the era of John Henry Darrell comes in. He was really a trusted protege of Morris, was as steeped in the pre-Raphaelite style as Morris was, and he served at the company for 54 years. In 1927, they were granted the Royal Warrant, and then the Second World War hit. At the same time that wallpaper became more common in homes, there were ways to try and make it cheaper. And so machine printed wallpapers essentially offered a lot of variety, a lot of style, and a much lower price. It was really at that point Morris started to really struggle because hand-blocked prints and wallpapers, for obvious reasons, were more expensive. And Morris & Co. went out of business in March 1940. Sanderson, remember I mentioned that name will come back around. Sanderson ended up purchasing Morris & Company for only 400 pounds. And with it came the full history, all the original books, all the original blocks. And it is today Sanderson and Morris, along with some other brands, are still within the same corporate structure. Sanderson launched a new Morris & Company collection after the war in 1957. It was still hand block printed. It was sort of the differentiator between Sanderson and Morris, was that Morris was still that hand block printed wallpaper. And then in 1984, they came out with the first machine printed collection. The 1957 Sanderson collection was met with not too much interest. In 1965, a sort of rock chic shop in London bought a bunch of low-price Morris fabric that was in what were considered more eccentric colors for the day. The shop was called Granny Takes a Trip. Ended up making blazers and scarves and shirts, and found themselves on the likes of George Harrison, Patty Boyd, Jimi Hendrix wore them. They became part of that cultural phenomenon, and really kind of rose to prominence again. You know, these were patterns that were for a long time really considered heritage patterns and maybe not necessarily of the moment, certainly not trendy, but it was a moment where those two things came together. And it was really what relaunched so much interest in Morris. So here we are in today's world, 2020 as it is. And Morris & Company is the holder of all the original archival prints, all of William Morris's original notes, many of the original blocks. And in 2000, they established an archive that's climate controlled. It's a central location for so many of William Morris's original designs and products. And the company continually uses them for inspiration, both in terms of new interpretations of wallpaper via colorways or scale. Also into more types of products, that they're not really constrained by whatever they can make within the bounds of Merton Abbey. They're now a more global company that takes into consideration not only their production facilities in the UK, but also artisans and craftsmen throughout the world that have a particular technique or artisanal craft to contribute. The new spirit of the arts and crafts movement is really where we sort of enter into this picture. We really focus this collection on using natural materials and manufacturing, keeping in mind Morris's love of not just nature outside his window, but how you brought that into your home. It allows us to tell the story of not only him as the artist, but also of May Morris. Some of this I thought might be kind of an interesting, just to sort of highlight what we do, but specifically how these patterns are so enduring and are so relevant in a contemporary marketplace. You can look at Canthus on the lower right-hand side. That's the pattern and how we reinterpret that pattern in a weaving. There's poppy and how we take parts of poppy and increase the scale and did an inlay of brass and actually wove in rattan. Then there's thistle. We were really inspired by so many of the original blocks that are used for block printing, which were made from wood. And we took that same kind of carving and did chairs that have that thistle pattern carved into them to mimic the block. We used marigold and how we punched metal lighting. Acorn serves as the pattern on the base of the table. And then Foda, which was part of the Pierre Morris collection that came out in 2019 from his journeys in Iceland. At the time, Rossetti was painting a lot of his wife, and I think he felt like he had to get out of Dodge a bit and went to Iceland and you know, learned Icelandic as one does and starts to translate Icelandic folk tales into English, and was really kind of in love with Icelandic folklore and culture and took a lot of drawings of things. So this really comes, photo comes from that period and that exploration. And that's something that the company has tapped more into in the last couple of years. So I think Morris in particular, Morris & Co. has continued to perpetuate the original values of William Morris and has also continued to keep his patterns in the contemporary marketplace. And I think it reminds us to revisit what was important in the arts and crafts movement. I think it reminds us to look at the full body of sort of the artist's contribution, both William Morris and then also subsequently May Morris, and how that has continued really now for such a long time. And it's interesting to see from our perspective, the reaction to these products in the marketplace. It's a whole new generation of people that are buying these products. And they may have heard of William Morris, they may not have, but the patterns still have such integrity and such persuasion for the contemporary buyer. And I think that's really, it absolutely gives credence to the thought that so much of this compelling. And so it's been really a joy to work with the archive and to really get to know the patterns and the history of the patterns. And we continue to think about how we can use those patterns in more three-dimensional ways. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much. Ooh. Ah.
She's back.
There, yeah, I'm back. There we go. Thank you so much, Shannon. And I actually had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you. I can't see, there you see me? I can't see myself. I guess it's okay, okay. I wondered, what do you look for when you are looking for patterns to select?
Well, that's a great question. So there are a couple of things. The one thing about Morris patterns, and certainly some of his original patterns and not things that have come out subsequently through Morris & Co., but we did have access to sort of the full breadth, is there were a couple of things, right? We wanted to be able to use some patterns that were recognizable to drive the recognition of the collection. So that's where you see Strawberry Thief coming in, where we're really taking Strawberry Thief, which is a very complex pattern, and essentially printing it and then wrapping it. So we're taking that same print and just wrapping it along our trunk collection. So because the pattern is so complex, you're a little limited about what you can do with it. But when there are other, and that's been fun to work with because it's one of those patterns that is recognizable the world over. But we also knew that we wanted to do weaving with the patterns, and there are patterns where you can isolate a part of a pattern. A campus is a great example where it is this repeat of the bows that kind of continues. And if you can isolate a part of that pattern, that's what we used. The same is true. Poppy is a very detailed print, but we could isolate a particular part of that print and increase the scale. And so really it's patterns that you feel like are compelling, but also how you plan on using them. Certain patterns you just can't weave with. Certain patterns they demand that they be used in a certain way, like in some kind of an embossed using willow bough, or it just sort of depends on what you want the pattern to do. Marigold is also a very sort of detailed pattern, but we were able to do it in a way, in a 3D way, that kind of took a snapshot of the pattern again. It just sort of depends on what you want the outcome to look like. And sometimes you try patterns using with the materiality that you want to interpret that pattern through. And sometimes it just doesn't work, and you have to sort of start over.
Okay, I'm going to stop the share so now we can see everybody, and
Oh, good.
there we go. Okay, that's better. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you.
Got a message from beyond to do that. We have there are a couple of questions in the box, and I had another question too. Someone asked, does Granny Takes a Trip, the shop, still exist? Do you know?
I don't think it does, which
I don't
is
think it
really
does.
too bad.
Yeah. Do they ever silk screen their wallpaper designs? Someone asked. I'm trying to remember. So when you go to the factory, there are several floors. Each floor represents a different technique. So if you look at Morris & Company papers today, they really use all of methods for printing. They do actually also have a digital printing. As I recall, in my mind, I can see a silk screen table, but I'm not sure, but I think there is. And I know that's not super helpful, but I think there might be. Someone else wanted to know, are William Morris designs being used in fashion today? I actually know the answer to that one, but you probably do too. So the archive has, over the last several years, done these collaborations. They did one with, and they vary in terms of what type of price point these collaborations. So they did one with Loewe, which is a Spanish, more couture leaning brand, and it was sold heavily at Liberty. The latest fashion one that was done that really hit the American market in particular was it was a global collaboration through H&M, which was a real smash success. And I think it brought this new spotlight onto the patterns and onto the company that I think it hadn't had in a long time. Someone asked, could you discuss the history and popularity of Liberty in comparison to Morris patterns? Yeah, so it's a bit confusing. I think so many of us in the American markets, our initial introduction to, at least on the commercial side of it, to Strawberry Thief was through Liberty. And so we didn't necessarily know it was a William Morris pattern. So while I'm not getting into too much of the intellectual property about it all, Liberty sold, like Abigail mentioned, Liberty, Heels, these old, really heritage department stores in the UK sold Morris & Co products. And so they retained some of those rights for
collaboration. And so even though it is a William Morris pattern and Morris and Company still produces the wallpaper, still produces fabric, because Liberty has sold Morris and Company forever, they have some of those patterns in their archive as well. And then there's also a third, well, there's a lot of entrants into this game from an intellectual property standpoint, because there's the V&A, because there's pieces from William Morris and the V&A, and then you've got some of the houses within the National Trust also sell things. And so you may see William Morris patterns coming from lots of different places, but Morris & Co. is sort of the purveyor of the original wallpaper and fabric, sort of in this long successive line.
Well, I have one more question, but we have one more question from people out there. Will you be creating other products with Morris inspiration in the future?
We will. We're working right now on some products for some specific retail customers in the US, and we will continue to bring them out. Interestingly about William Morris is obviously hugely popular in the UK, also very popular in Scandinavia. The third largest market for William Morris is in Japan. And so there is a great emphasis on developing products for that market in particular. But we're a San Francisco-based customer, and we'll always be doing products for our home market.
I just had one last question. What was it like to work in the archive?
Oh, it's my favorite part. It's the best. It's one of the things I love most about my job, to be really honest. There's something humbling about going into an archive. I have no training as an archivist, and I look at those who do with reverence, and I say, please tell me what I'm allowed to touch or breathe on, or even really put my eyes on. What's interesting about going into archives is they're vast, right? You almost have to have a little bit of a strategic plan before you get there. What you want to see, what you're interested in learning more about. We're not given endless time to sort of weigh down the curators and the archivists. We're there to ask certain pertinent questions. I could go in and spend days just asking all the questions. Unfortunately, that's not always allowed or encouraged. Having said that, it usually involves wearing gloves. It usually involves carefully letting people pull out drawers, pointing at things you're interested in, and really putting together a little bit of a list before you go in so that you know exactly what you want to look at. For us, what we wanted to look at when we got there is the original blocks were very important. We wanted to see how they were carved. We knew we wanted to do something with carving. And so we really wanted to look at what those original blocks were made of. What materials were they made of? Stories about the artisans who carved the blocks. That was important to us. I really wanted to see some original colorations. So that was another thing we had on our list. And then also how scale changes. Because some of these patterns have been in the line for 100+ years, the scale changes to meet the moment to a certain extent. And so, and to their credit, they've allowed it to do that. There are some that really don't allow that. And so this is kind of exciting to watch how scale and color change through time. And so that was another thing that we wanted to look at. And then how the archive plays with the real commercial development and ongoing business of Morris and Company today. So when we were there, they were working on the May Morris collection, which really relied heavily on embroidery and a lot of maize patterns. And so it was wonderful to see that direct link between the archive and the development of a new collection of her patterns in new colorways, using new techniques, modern techniques, to achieve some of the things that Mae Morris did with a needle and thread. And so that was really exciting. And also it builds this bridge between the world that I live in on a daily basis and the archive itself.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for joining us. I really
Welcome.
appreciate a great presentation, and I really appreciate you hanging in there through all of our little technical challenges. So,
My pleasure.
so thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.